more resilient to external disturbances as well, including climate change. Now, unfortunately, the forest reserves are not managed with biodiversity conservation objectives in mind. In fact, most are not managed at all and are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to encroachment and even divestment for other land uses. So while they contribute immensely to biodiversity conservation, their roles are overlooked, and this has to be rectified very quickly to make them more secure and make the most of their contribution to conservation of Sri Lanka's biodiversity. But the sad and unfortunate part is that there is so little coordination and cooperation between the DWC and the Forest Department at the moment, and something needs to be done to change this situation. Now, conservation of these wet zone forests, especially the forest reserves, is not just about conserving species, but also for ecosystem services they provide. The montane and sub-montane forests in particular are critically important for their watershed values, including headwater protection, erosion control, and flood control, for instance. The central mountains of the island are, of course, Sri Lanka's water towers, and these mountains capture orographic rainfall from two alternating monsoons and distributes the water throughout the country through a system of 106 rivers that radiate out from the mountains. And for those like me who have opted to forget what we learned for O-level geography, orographic rainfall is induced when the warm, moist monsoon winds that blow in from the sea are intercepted by these monsoons, by the mountains and forced up. Now, as the air rises and cools, it loses the capacity to hold the water, which is then released as rain. So without the central mountains, Sri Lanka would be a very, very different place to live in, because these winds will just sweep across the island and desiccate the interior. Think about Australia, with tiny ice rock sitting in the middle of a desert. Now, if they can somehow grow that rock larger, they'll have a much different ecosystem there. Okay, so as the rains fall on these central mountains, the forest and the ground cover allows the water to percolate and infiltrate into the ground, and then releases it gradually and in a sustained way. It retards surface water runoff that also then causes erosion and consequent landslides and floods, and then droughts when the water dries out. Forested watersheds sustain healthy rivers and are also important to protect the coral reefs offshore. If these rivers carry heavy sediment loads because of erosion, they become deposited, sediment becomes deposited on the coral reefs, on the seagrasses, and kill them. So there's a great urgency to protect these wet zone forests, because the forested montane watersheds are important to ensure sustained and regulated environmental flows, and they are also where our most critically important biodiversity lives. Unfortunately, there is a tremendous pressure on the Forest Department to divest these forests for other land uses. And this will convert them into agricultural areas, into settlements and other uses that will then affect these environmental services as well. And we're already seeing the impacts. Recently, the people in the Knuckles mountain range complained that they didn't have enough water and the water sources are drying out. Well, there is widespread forest conversion in the Knuckles, and especially due to clearing for chaina, for illegal logging and fires and other land uses. The Forest Department, however, is severely undercapacitated to deal with these threats. So we need a different, effective management and protection paradigm. So what do we do? How can we maintain these forests and their biodiversity and the ecosystem services in the face of all these threats? Well, government commitment backed by policy and enforcement is key. Now, I should have mentioned that the strategic conservation plan for the Terayak landscape was included in Nepal's 5-year development plan. So it became a priority within the government's own development plan. Now, here in Sri Lanka, we seem to have an opening. Sri Lanka became a signatory to the Paris Agreement at COP21 in December 2015. And soon after he was elected, the president himself attended the conference, since he was also the Minister of Environment, and made the very ambitious pledge to increase Sri Lanka's forest cover to 32% by 2030. And at the Asia Bond Challenge held in May 2017, which was an event that basically brought together 12 Asian countries to identify ways to collaborate on forest landscape restoration, Sri Lanka pledged to restore 200,000 hectares of land by 2030 as a nationally determined contribution. This pledge also helped to tip the Bond Challenge over its 150 million hectare milestone. So it was a really important contribution. So now forest conservation and restoration not only became a national priority, but also became a global commitment. And we have also now completed a RED Plus strategy that includes restoration and reforestation as a show of commitment for forest conservation and to reforest degraded areas for carbon revenues. So we have all these international commitments and agreements and covenants. Oh, and he also promised to take, and I quote, stringent legal action against, quote, racketeers who destroy forests. Sounds great, right? It's a great scenario. We are on the correct track, but, well, not quite. Because the reality is that despite these presidential pledges and promises, the remaining forests are being encroached into and cut down all over the country, but especially in the wet zone. Almost all of it is illegal forest clearing and land grabbing, usually with political patronage and connivance. But there are also sanctioned projects that are being located in intact forest areas, including within protected areas. So we have a contradiction in terms of policy and action and what's actually happening on the ground. While on the one hand, the president himself has pledged to increase forest cover, including on a global stage, members in his own government are complicit and even actively supporting the destruction of these national assets. And look who woke up to this problem just 3 days ago. But yet the lies are being perpetuated. For example, this year at the Chogam conference, the government announced or reiterated its policy to conserve mangroves and shamelessly accepted accolades. And I say shamelessly because all the while there have been plans in the works to actually divest part of Vedital Thivu National Nature Reserve and convert over 3,000 hectares of mangroves to prawn farms and other aquaculture ponds. Now this is Sri Lanka's largest remaining mangrove patch. So where is the credibility? What about the promises made? Remember that these are pledges and promises and pronouncements made on global fora. Well, now let's take a look at what's been happening over the past 50 to 60 years. Sri Lanka has lost most of its forest cover during this time. In 1956, we had about 44% forest cover. But most of this has been converted and fragmented. The current forest cover is estimated at about 27%, but it's actually probably much less than this because this statistic is based on 2010 data released by the FAO. Now, although the map was published in 2010, the satellite data are at least a couple of years older than that. So we are talking about data that's over a decade old. And in the meantime, we have been losing about 8,000 hectares of forest every year, according to the Forest Department's own statistics. And they estimate that reforestation will cost about $100 million US. So doesn't it make sense to keep what we have as a greater priority? Doesn't that make more sense? And also, remember, forests are very complex organisms with various ecological connections and feedback loops that maintain the ecosystem processes and forest structure and ecological communities. Simply planting trees is not going to get back those ecological links and the biological diversity, especially the endemic species that have gone extinct, and get back a real forest. Now, we at the Environmental Foundation recently did an analysis of our protected areas, both forest reserves and the DWC protected areas that have lost forest cover since 2010. And we use the Global Forest Watch database, which is an online resource that uses updated satellite, Landsat satellite imagery to show areas across the world where forest cover is being lost. Now, the protected areas in red and orange show the DWC reserves and Forest Department's forest reserves that have lost more than 50 hectares of forest. And as you can see, most of the protected areas, including our flagship protected areas, have been impacted. So again, the promises and pledges made even on international fora are hollow. And the consequences of this destruction of ecosystems is not trivial. It's not just about loss of a few species, it's also about livelihoods, it's about lives, economic losses, and even governance. And that's what the general public and the politicians have to understand and must be made to understand. And maybe the message that they may understand. A senior politician when presented with objections to mini hydro plants in intact forests and forest reserves had said that we can't allow projects to be stopped just because of a few frogs. So there's a clear lack of understanding of the deeper issues and consequences of forest and biodiversity loss among the politicians. They must be made to understand that continued conversion, degradation, and fragmentation of the forest and also of the coral reefs will compromise the ability of these ecosystems to build resilience against natural disasters, including climate change. Because the impacts of climate change are becoming now manifested. They're becoming more intense and becoming more widely and frequently and severely manifested. That biodiversity conservation is not just about saving a few frogs and plants. It's about saving human communities. Unfortunately, again, we have to dumb down that message to maybe sub-O-level standards, which in turn, itself is a challenge. Maybe cartoons like this may be the answer, I don't know. But the thing is, there is an even greater urgency to make this messaging available now because of the emerging threats of climate change. The climate change scenarios for Sri Lanka suggest that there will be a general increase in temperature. Broadly, the dry zone will become drier, the wet zone will become wetter. There will be more extreme and unpredictable weather events. So we will continue to experience extreme rainfall events, with a lot of rain falling over a short period of time between long periods of drought. Severe storms and cyclones will cause strong waves and wave surges that impact the coastal areas, which support large and dense human populations. So guess what? Looks like climate change is here now. It's here. It's a present. It's not some airy fable that's far off in the future that we can ignore. The weather patterns that we have been experiencing in the past few years are consistent with these climate change predictions. This is a new norm that we will have to live with and adapt to. Now, gone are the days when we could depend on predictable monsoons. And think about the importance of this predictability, because so many people's livelihoods and lives are dependent on it, from farmers and fishermen to the tourist industry and event organizers, from, say, sports events to even wedding planners, which seems to be trivial, but think about the huge economic investments that they have to make as individuals. And the list goes on. So there are severe socio-economic consequences to environmental degradation and destruction of ecosystems. Let's just take a look at what's been happening in the past few years. Let's just go back to May 2016. Now, you may recall the severe floods that happened, or maybe you've forgotten by now, but many people lost their lives, property, livelihoods, and some of the world's most expensive expressways drowned in floods. And by the government's own estimate, it cost the government and us, the taxpayers, over 1.5 billion US dollars. That's a billion with a B. And then just 8 months later, by January 2017, most of the country was gripped in a severe, prolonged drought that again cost us another 1.5 billion US dollars. Farmers whose crops were lost committed suicide since they were unable to pay their debts. More than half the country was stuck without water. People became dehydrated, fell sick, and some died. And then in May 2017, a year later, part of the country again flooded after more than half a meter of rain fell in the southwestern hills just within a couple of days. These floods claimed over 200 lives, and the cost of these floods have not been disclosed, but is probably in the same ballpark as the previous floods. And of course, this year it happened all over again. So this is becoming a trend now, recurring severe floods due to short, intense rainfall events that devastated part of the country while the rest is affected by a prolonged drought that has now lasted for 4 years. In the meantime, the coastlines are being eroded because the coral reefs and the mangroves are being removed, and these ecosystems are the first lines of defense against wave surges and storms. The Coast Conservation Department is now about to replenish the beaches from Colombo to Panadura at a cost of 800 million rupees. This money, as I understand, has been passed by the cabinet. Now, they don't say if this is going to be repeated again next year, because come the next monsoon, the sand may get washed away again. So continued destruction of natural barriers and ecosystems that ameliorate the impacts of climate change will only exacerbate these natural disasters, while this destruction and degradation is also removing our biodiversity and is also affecting lives and livelihoods and Sri Lanka's economic development agenda as well. So can we let people remain vulnerable to these natural disasters? Can Sri Lanka, already struggling economically, afford these additional economic setbacks? If you look at the economic indicators, they clearly say no, that we can't. The central bank in its report also very clearly stated that the agricultural sector and the overall economy suffered because of the floods and drought. And so did international economic indicators like Moody's. And the government is now desperately looking for foreign direct investment. But who is going to invest when there is no environmental safety and security? When there is a high probability that the factories and the infrastructure that are built will become flooded and destroyed? when transportation and communication conduits may fail, when the chances of access to sustained water and other ecosystem services are low. So there's a huge economic opportunity cost here as well. And this is a societal cost that we will all have to bear collectively, including the future generations, because of the selfish and self-serving illegal actions of a few politicians and politically connected people. And of course, this also translates into a governance issue. So soon after the local government election debacle recently, the Prime Minister and some of the senior ministers blamed the rejection of the government on the natural disasters that cost people their lives, livelihoods, and economic losses. And it's not surprising, but there it is, and a eureka moment that probably will soon be forgotten. And yet, does the government have an adaptation plan? Even though it sort of kind of acknowledges that maybe, sort of seems to be a problem. So far, the plan seems to be limited to getting water bowsers to distribute water to drought-stricken people. And of course, civil society and the corporate sector also steps in to provide relief to flood-affected people, being the compassionate and benevolent nation we think we are. And of course, we do pray a lot, hoping that the problems will go away and be sorted out. And then again, as a multicultural, multi-ethnic country, we have lots of gods and deities to pray to at every street corner, but even they are having trouble keeping their heads above water, so I'm not sure if they're listening either. But we seem to be, as a nation, just content to do this, but this is not an adaptation plan. These are all desperate, reactive actions. And actually, this is beyond desperation, this is despair. I think this picture is a great allegory for the government's position in the midst of these crises. When you don't know what to do, just focus on yourself. It's a kind of displacement behavior. Or maybe with this lot, this is a better allegory. I had trouble deciding, so we'll let you take your pick. I kind of like them both, actually. But here's the thing. There's enough scientific evidence now to very clearly show that intact natural ecosystems build resilience against climate change and consequent natural disasters. So how about an ecosystem-based adaptation plan, planned and implemented at scale? The forests, the coral reefs, the wetlands, the mangroves, all become important contributors.